We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Ladies and gentlemen, it is always a pleasure to welcome to the program the person that inspired this, I would call it jingle, maybe.
Are you ready for some Digby? Yeah. Are you ready for some Digby? Digby, yeah. And a bit of hullabaloo. A bit of hullabaloo should do ya. How about some hullabaloo? Just rub it on ya. It's so good for ya.
Wait a second. I don't remember that part of it.
I don't either. I did not register that.
I had been playing a shorter one, but I found a longer one.
Oh my gosh. There you go. Wow. That's great. It's about time. Ladies and gentlemen.
Song invented chillwave.
Well, I was going to say, Heather Parton, Digby, welcome to the program. That song is so chill that it almost feels not of this era or even remotely appropriate. And
well,
maybe
neither am I, so that's it.
Well, I don't feel like. I mean, I guess there could be some people who are appropriate to this era, but it really just seems like, and I'm obviously getting a little bit reflective because we're at the end of the year. We're arguably at the end of the decade. Many people will mistakenly assume that we are, and so we have to play along. Really ends at the end of 2021, but 2020, but nevertheless, let's just spend 2 minutes talking about the past 10 years. Nuts, sure. Right? Nuts.
Crazy. And, I've been through some crazy decades, and this one really takes the cake. And it seems like it's both rushed by, it seems like it was yesterday that it was, 2009. But at the same time, there has been so much that has happened that it also feels like, it's been 50 years instead of 10. It's been amazing. And I was thinking about this last night. The beginning of this decade was Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
Can you believe that?
Yeah.
And I think that, and reflecting on that, I think that really this decade, trying to see, think about what really happened. And it's tempting to talk about Trump and, all that. And of course, that was, to me, that was just the natural evolution of where the Republican Party had been going for a long time. But the rise of the left, I think, has been unremarked upon as this decade, as, maybe the most important part of this decade. I mean, we know the rise of the right. We've, talked about it ad nauseum. But when Occupy Wall Street started, it started in 2010 in September, and I think it kind of, I think it will be looked back upon as a watershed moment. Obviously, we'd all been talking about that stuff for years, and the left had been building itself in small increments, but that really, really bursted into a new level, I think, of awareness. And it's why we, now see, like on the presidential debate stage, two, left-wing candidates who are doing very well. One of them may end up being president. And you see a left that is far more influential, and you see the ideas that undergirded all that becoming much, much more mainstream. And, this stuff does take time. So 10 years, that seems, I'm sorry to, tell all you young folks that it takes that kind of time, but sadly it does. But that's why, you keep at it. And, here we are 10 years later, and a lot of what they were talking about in the street in Zuccotti Park are on the mainstream stage with Democratic candidates debating about it. So this is.
I think that is. I think that's such a. I think that's so spot on, and I do think that we're not going to hear much about that, but that is really the story of this decade. Donald Trump is the culmination of stuff that existed back in 2008, without a doubt. was the culmination of the conservative movement. You and I have been talking about that in the aughts quite a bit. And I mean, I distinctly remember there are two moments where I distinctly remember that give me a sense of like where, of what my sense was as to where things were around that time. When Current, the Al Gore network launched as a left network, when Olbermann left MSNBC and went over to Current, and I don't think it had quite launched yet. They were meeting, and I remember meeting with the dude who was running it, some idiot from CNN. I mean, just like sort of like, I think he was the one who like developed the hologram or something like that. Like, you know, when
God.
But I remember sitting in his office, and this must have been about 2009, 2008. And I said, you know, I think the big argument that's going to happen now is outside versus the inside. The people who are agitating on the outside versus the inside, because it was clear that Obama by the summer of 2009, that Obama was already backtracking on a lot of stuff that he said was really important to him. Particularly the bankruptcy bill was the first thing.
You bet.
And then I remember when we launched this show, one of the first guests we had, maybe the first one, was Winner Takes All Economy. I think it was like Jacob Hacker's book. I think so.
Uh-huh.
But I remember the idea being like, nobody's talking about this, you know, the concentration of wealth. I mean, you know, Bernie had been talking about it, but Bernie Sanders was way off the national radar. I don't think he had ever been on a national program except for like maybe a Donahue sort of like documentary piece. Like, look at this guy. This is crazy. You know, he's a socialist who's running, you know, who's the mayor of Burlington or something. I mean, we had him on the old Majority Report, but there was no one else talking about that. The words wealth inequality, the concept of the 99%, it did not exist at that time. In terms of like mass media and broad conversation. Obviously, there's been people who've been talking about it for forever, including Bernie. But in terms of like the way that you would hear it in the news or the national psyche, it just was not there. And in some respects, that's what I think what took people for, you know, such a surprise with Occupy, at least the sort of the broader society. And I remember it was another guy, I think his name is DeGraw, David DeGraw, I think his name was, who had this concept of, you know, there was a bunch of different people who were responsible, I think, for Occupy. You know, some of it came out of Adbusters, some of it was David Graeber. There were others, but this guy David DeGraw earlier that year had been trying had been writing or talking about stuff that within X amount of miles of Wall Street, there was a huge number of people who had been devastated by, you know, the 2008 crisis. And I think people were still, you know, people remember when we're talking about 2010, we're really only like 12 months out from when it really, the crap hit the fan. Right. I mean, it was in the fall of 2008, right before the election, that we hadn't even quite bottomed out. I don't think the bottom was hit until like early 2009 or so, maybe even mid 2009 in terms of job losses and whatnot. So this is very fresh in the mind, I think. You know, we were the financial crisis had hit, but the sort of reverberations were still happening, and people, I think, were just not conscious of what was going on. And since Occupy, the idea of wealth inequality as the primary problem in this country just got just exploded, and it impacted everything. I agree with you. I don't think there is like 10% as much a recognition of how quickly this country has moved to the left, or how strong the left has become in these 10 years as there should be, because that is really the primary story.
Well, that's what I think, and I have been, I mostly cover what's happening with the right wing. It's always been sort of my beat, and so I'm very interested and frankly frightened to death of what they have become. So I tend to keep my eyes on that, but it seems obvious to me, and those of us who've been watching politics closely on the internet for the last couple of decades. People like you and me have been doing this sort of thing. You can really see the change. I mean, if I go back and look at the stuff I was writing back in the early 2000s on my blog and, the forums and various places where we were all discussing this stuff, we were way, way out of the mainstream. I mean, There just was nothing, as you point out. And of course, the financial crisis was the catalyst. But, and there, of course, you have to give credit to not just politicians like Bernie, but there were economists and others who were going, whoa, something's really going to happen here. And they'd been talking about it for a while. But the reaction that happened to it with Occupy Wall Street, which was, it really shocked people. I don't know if people remember. The press was walking around like they were, doing anthropological, sort of missions deep into the Amazon. They were looking at the people who were doing this. And, that Occupy had tried to do a lot of things, that they were experimenting with and doing it, in these various, occupied territories around the country, around the world. Let's not forget this was a global thing. It wasn't just happening here. And the fact that reaction happened that way, that this was kind of, this is a version of street protest that was kind of unique. We hadn't seen anything quite like that. And I think it was very effective in implanting, particularly in the younger generation who, this may have been for many people, their first sort of contact with the left.
It was for me.
It was for Jamie.
I protested the Iraq War in high school. We did not stop the Iraq War. I kind of gave up and did drugs for a few years. And then I got involved again around the time of Occupy. And I haven't stopped being involved since then.
Or taking drugs.
Yes, I have not stopped taking drugs.
There you go. But that definitely, I can see that, because if that's a moment of kind of clarity and there are a lot of young people your age, this is a big generation, and the fact that was sort of happening there, I think that may have fueled what we're seeing. And it goes in a number of different directions. It's not just economics. This is about a certain form of activism and just general worldview, when climate change and guns and Black Lives Matter. There's all this stuff that sort of has bubbled up in the last 10 years as and I would categorize all of that as being part of the left. I think that's, that moment really did sort of, it changed it opened the eyes of a generation. And I think that it's going to be remembered as something very important in the development of world politics.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And a lot of people went on from that and applied lessons to other places. And it's interesting too. In many respects, it in some ways it launched both. In terms of like national acclaim and their identities, it launched both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And I think in terms of like it empowered both of them in different ways at different points over the course of the decade. I also think that part of this is that, and I don't want to reduce it too much, but I think coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, maybe there's, somebody could draw some type of correlation or some type of causation between the age in which boomers became in the aughts and their aggressiveness in terms of like seeking, wealth, and it being driven by these innovations. And, it's hard to sort of disentangle this stuff. But there was a fire lit. There were embers, and I think, and there was obviously this sort of like inciting moment in terms of the financial crisis. But I also think, as someone who's a member of a generation that's sort of like will never, Generation X is always going to be, in the back seat, right? It's just not. We weren't in the front seat for a long time because the boomers were there. And then the millennials essentially just the first time they got into the car, it feels like they were in the front seat. And the reason is, I'm quite convinced, it's just sheer numbers. I mean, we live in a consumer-based society. And, whether it's actually, purchasing or just consuming media and also generating media. And the fact is that the boomers, the amount of boomers in our society was such that they dictated our culture and our politics and every aspect of our society. And the Gen X just never had room and never had the purchasing power, just to reduce it down to that. I think it's an oversimplification, but it gets the point across. Never had the purchasing power to change society and the market, if you will. But millennials come in and they, ironically, don't actually have the purchasing power, but they have the cultural consumption power, let's say. Yeah. And
a lot of these things don't cost anything except for your data, right?
Right. I'm just using that as an analogy because I think it's actually sort of like specifically untethered from that because,
cultural capital, I think is the word they use.
Yes. Thank you. And it's the cultural capital. But it's because of sheer numbers, I think, really at the end of the day. Right. I think that when you have the ability, when you get that sort of feedback of like, oh, there's a lot of people who are experiencing what I'm experiencing now, which is our aggregate wealth is, a third of what it would have been if we had been born 30 years ago or 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And but our ability to sort of change culture is like, the way it is with young people, except for we have the buying power, the consumption power. We can create our new, and I think that crested during this decade as well. And I think we're seeing that now. We're seeing it like, with this new generation. There's a reason it seems to me that like we have the two, this is a little reductive too, but the most powerful segments of our Congress right now are people who are nearing 80 years old, right? In terms of Democrats, and people who are just nearing 30 years old. That's pretty stunning. And I don't, there's, maybe that happens a lot in history, but when you look at the two biggest fundraisers in the Democratic Party in the House, it's Nancy Pelosi and AOC. And I think that is also the story of like what this, and this next decade will be the AOC's, the squad's decade, however you want to say it, it will be their decade. But this is the one that sort of gave rise to it.
Absolutely. And that is looking at the future. That is where it is. Now, I will say this, just to, being a boomer, I have to point this out, that Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, the rest, they're not actually boomers. They're silent. They're older than most boomers are. That means nothing other than just to say it. But yes, the baby boom. And also just, you have to look at the fact that, the baby boom are, they're getting old and they're going to die. They'll be around, though, for a while. They're, I should say we, because I'm one of them. They're going to, we're going to be around for the next 20 years or so in a large numbers, and we'll have to be accommodated on some level. But yes, the next decade is the rise of the millennials, or the assumption of cultural ascendancy of the millennials. And, this is good news for those of us who care about all these issues, because the millennial generation is very I mean, not all. I mean, we don't want to you don't want to paint with too broad a brush, because there is an ascendant right as well, and there's plenty of young people that are involved in that. But the vast majority are, liberal, tolerant, concerned people about all the issues that those of us on the left, boomers and otherwise, have been caring about for decades, and kind of flailing against a very, very organized right wing that has done everything in its power to stop us from doing the things that we believed in. And they are also aging out, and they're also their movement, the conservative movement, which has been ascendant since I was a kid, going all the way back to Goldwater. It's dead now. I'm not sure what's going to replace it, but whatever they called it, thought they were, and called themselves, is no longer operative. I mean, there is no ideology anymore. This is purely just a tribal kind of cult that is, concerned with plutocracy and power, and there's nothing else to it. So, we are entering a very, very untrod sort of time. We don't know where the ideology is going, but I do kind of on the right, but I do see it on the left seems pretty coherent to me, and that kind of gives me hope, because that's the group I'm with, that I've always been with, and I'm glad to be with them as I get older and they start to take power, because I feel actually optimistic about that. If we can get through these few years of transition, I think that the next epoch in American history, in the world's history, theoretically anyway, should be a lot better with this particular group.
I think that's actually also another great point is, I remember in 04, 05, reading Sullivan, I can't even remember his first name now, and Andrew Sullivan, and him writing about how there are members of the of the conservative universe. We used to call them movement conservatives, but there are members of the conservative universe who are not preaching George Bush is not a true conservative. And I remember at the time saying, like, this dude doesn't quite get it. Like, this is like saying, people are just not speaking Latin enough anymore. And it's, you don't even hear people making that argument anymore. Like, it's so far gone. The conservative ideology is so bereft that, and even almost like republicanism has lost has become untethered, right? Like the whole thing about the deficit goals. Now, I'm quite convinced that Republicans are going to reconvene in some fashion. Like, I keep reading about, these never Trumpers who are out there going like, the Republican Party has finally destroyed itself by supporting Donald Trump in this thing or that thing. And I feel like that article, I've been reading it, the same thing for 3 years. And the fact of the matter is that they need nothing to reconvene and reconstruct themselves. They will just come back as they were and pretend like none of this ever happened. But the problem is the ideology has been hollowed out. There is no ideology, and it becomes almost at that point, it becomes untethered. Even if they never believed it, you lose the watershed in which you're telling your stories about it. And that's when I think, it's not hard for me to imagine we continue on with this intense polarization, and it is, you and I watched the right move further out on the sort of the spectrum of the to the right, and we're now seeing the left say like, well, we have some ideas too, and are actually headed out in that way too, which is and getting stronger, frankly, which is increasing the polarization. And in my estimation, it's the only way to go. There's no going around this. We need to go through it. And but when we do get towards the other end of that side, the idea of like the conservative movement is 30% of the country, and they're aiding and abetting, sort of like right-wing terrorist. It's not hard to come up with that scenario. Let's put it that way.
It really isn't. And I mean, I've been watching this my whole life. And the conservative movement was the most powerful political movement in America through most of my lifetime. I mean, we're talking about, starting with the 70s, going forward up until really pretty recently. They pretty much owned our politics. Now, again, the cultural capital that the baby boomers had was much more liberal. I mean, we saw a lot of changes with gay rights and women's rights and civil rights, and across the board there was a lot of progress made during that period. But on a political level, the right owned it. Really, the left has been flailing through that entire period. And
I feel like we were this close to getting Reagan on a dime.
Yeah. Oh, we were. I mean, they had a thing called the Reagan Legacy Project, where they were renaming all these airports. I mean, you see it all over the place, in schools and roads. I mean, they were going to turn him, this was a kind of a Leninist approach, spearheaded by a guy named Grover Norquist. Yep. And, you haven't heard much from him lately.
No.
And, of course, he got his big tax cut, so, he's probably just counting his money somewhere. But, this has been the political story of my lifetime up until now. And that's one reason why I sort of flagged the Occupy Wall Street as being sort of, the big, the financial crisis and Occupy Wall Street as a huge catalyst for change. And what has happened in its wake is that we're seeing the crumbling of what was called the conservative movement for 40 years. And what is going to replace it, I don't know. I think you're right. I mean, I'm kind of terrified by it in a way, because there is a lot of tribal identification among those people, and driven by all the things we talk about all the time, the racial animus and the sense of having their prerogatives and their privileges being challenged by women and people of color and foreigners and everything else. So, they're not going to go away. I mean, these people still exist, and it's a white party, basically, people with a lot of money behind them. There's that whole, kleptocracy, plutocracy that undergirds everything they've done for many, many years, and that's not going to go away. So I'm not saying that the fight is over. I think in some ways it's just beginning, but it's a different fight than the one we've been having. And I think that's where you get the young people coming in. They have a much greater sense of confidence about this, and rightly so. For people like me who were, I'm thinking back to the Reagan years, where it's just like, oh, geez, you got to be kidding me. I mean, it was like we didn't even exist. We were like, completely. Democrats sounded like right-wing Republicans. I mean, it was really, really it was depressing for anybody who cared about any of these issues. And that's just not true anymore. It's a different thing. The fight is now engaged. And I always used to say, for years, this isn't a pendulum that we're talking about. It's a seesaw. And unless the left gets some heft on its side, we're going to be hanging out up there while the right wing continues to hold down all the power and all the the resources and everything else in politics. So this is what's changing, and the character of it I can't really describe. I don't know, and I'm afraid there could be violence. It could be something pretty awful, because in the context that this is happening, of climate change, for instance, we're going to see a lot of disruption, and it's not going to be pretty. But I don't think that we're going in unarmed this time. I don't think that the left is without is kind of in as vulnerable position as it was for the last 40 years.
I mean, the other one last thing, and then we'll talk about what happened last night, but. Okay. I just think one of the markers for that is, I just remember in 2004, getting phone calls from right wingers on the radio going like, "You're a liberal," and I'd say, "Well, actually, I mean, I'm to the left of that, but so." And he's like, "Well, you just admitted it," and I'm like, "Well, I'm on a liberal talk radio network." Like, it was, to call yourself a liberal in this country in the late 90s, early aughts was particularly in the early aughts after 9/11 was in some areas, dangerous. I mean, literally dangerous. And because
after
of
9/11, it
right,
sure was.
because of the potential for right-wing violence. I mean, this is not theoretical and or hypothetical. And within 10, 12 years of that time, when you call yourself a liberal, it is, or when someone calls you a liberal, it is, to the extent that it's like supposed to be an insult, it is coming from the left.
That is
true. And that to me is
guilty as charged.
That is just, I mean, that is an amazing turnabout. You know, I mean, it is just an amazing a change in our society. I mean, I think that's sort of like now, like, I don't know that people who aren't involved in politics are not, you know, are quite as aware of that. I don't think that's, you know, if I was to say to, you know, I don't know, some civilians, you know, some normies that you're a liberal, they wouldn't go, okay, whatever. What's for dinner? You know, but I think the idea within this type of, you know, within our type of profession and in our, you know, sort of, you know, our non-civilian world, as it were, that's pretty stunning, I think.
It is, and, you know, liberal and progressive, both of those words and the arguments that we have within our own coalition over that, notwithstanding, neither of those words are now used as, you know, just outright epithets by, you know, average society, I don't think. And
right.
That was not true 20 years ago.
That's right.
I mean, you were a communist or maybe even, you know, a child molester or something. I mean, it was terrible. It was really fearful to assume that word to describe yourself in some company. I mean, I have conservative relatives, and I was kind of, you know, maybe, you know, okay, well, I vote Democratic some of the time, you know, but and then walk away from the conversation because that was not something that you wanted to call yourself. And I think that anybody now, you say I'm a progressive or a liberal or whatever, and I don't think it gets that same response in, you know, polite society that it did, you know, 20, 25 years ago.
Right. I mean, you know, Michael Dukakis was afraid to be labeled a liberal, and not because that would signify that he did not have a, you know, a Marxist critique of what's going on. It was, you know, because he did, if he was called that. But go ahead.
Can I say something about Occupy? I feel like it's fairly on topic because we're talking about it, and I was a part of Occupy Wall Street and really forged a lot of the politics I have now at that point in time. It also didn't hurt that I was dating sort of a libertarian communist. But the primary goal of Occupy Wall Street was not to realign the Democratic Party. And it wasn't to elect a social democrat president. It might be a good outcome of it. But I mean, the people that I knew, the people that I met around that time were very principled anarchists and libertarian communists, those types who really had a horizon level goal of overthrowing capitalism. Nobody thought that we were going to do it by occupying Wall Street, but it was the start of something. And we've seen, you know, uprisings around the world. And I think perhaps the liberal left, the progressive left is stronger than it used to be. The anti-capitalist left is also stronger than it used to be, but it's still incredibly weak. Like DSA has 60,000 members, I think, or thereabouts. It's about as strong as it's been maybe since the 60s. Still not strong enough to accomplish our goals. But like I still hope that we can have some sort of popular front of the left with leftists and liberals. And I appreciate the love that you guys are giving to Occupy right now, because like it shows that you recognize, even if you don't agree with anarchists and communists, that you need us as part of some larger left movement and popular front. And like, I'm hoping, like I said the other day, I see a few different paths forward to like solve the problems, the crisis that capitalism is in right now and has been in arguably since the 70s. One of them goes through social democracy and a parliamentary road to socialism. The other one involves a lot more human misery to come first. And, you know, given those choices, I would of course prefer the one that involves less human misery. And I think you guys are probably in agreement with me on that.
Yeah, of course. And I would say, I mean, my experience of having been down at Zuccotti Park and gone to a couple of the other encampments and talking to a lot of people at the time was that there was a diversity. I mean, there's certainly, I think, the group of folks, associated with Graeber that started, Zuccotti were definitely more sort of like the anarcho in various flavors, I think, of that.
Yeah, fresh off the New School occupation.
Yes.
Too.
But there was also, like I say, this David DeGraw who had a sort of a contemporaneous idea, I think was probably more of like a almost, just a sort of an anti-finance type of lefty. And I think there was my sense was that there was a sort of a broad range of people who were literally at Zuccotti and certainly coming out for the marches.
That's where Tim Pool made his bones.
It's where Tim Pool and the guy he was with actually going around was quite good. And I can't remember his name, but I think he recognized that there was something up with Tim Pool quite early. But there was a broad range of people, from my experience at Zuccotti, and I was, down there. I was not obviously sleeping out there, but was down there on a fairly regular basis. Interviewing people.
One of my critiques as well of anarchist horizontalism, which is that it is a little too open-ended and a little too disorganized and can decay into all different sorts of liberalism and even conservatism if you're not careful.
But even in the first week, there was a mix of people there. I mean that, and I think it's certainly the sort of anti-hierarchy folks drove the place without a doubt. I mean, I think, and that's, that cuts both ways in some ways, but regardless of, it's not, I don't think it's controversial to say that when things move to the left, it's because, people on the furthest most regions of the left are pulling it that way. And different people end up, in the sort of the concentric circles. And in my experience anyways, it usually lands not, close to the poles. It's just a question of how far is the pole on the left. But
yeah, it was definitely instructive for me as well. I decided not to be a full-on anarchist after that because I was like, well, I feel like we could be a little better organized in some ways. And, some of these folks need a more Marxist material analysis, which is I did not know what that meant at the time, but I just knew that it was something I wanted.
You just knew you had to get away from the drum circles. And
that's for sure.